The Western man improves his life by adding things. The Eastern man improves his life by taking things away. Which one should you choose?
It's very interesting because in my own background, by heritage, my parents are Chinese. My mother's from Taiwan. But I guess by circumstance, I actually grew up and I was raised abroad in the West, educated in the West, and I spent most of my life, all the way up to my adult life, living in the West. So basically, I've been ingrained with the Western mind. And the whole idea of it really is to, as you mentioned, to add more, to accumulate, to focus on yourself. And I've always operated with that sort of mindset for a very long time. But you also sense this sense of deficiency that no matter how much you accumulate, it's always never enough. And so what you mentioned, that difference between the Western mind adding more and the Eastern mind subtracting, it's actually very interesting because when we look at the concept of liberty in philosophy, Isaiah Berlin actually distinguished between negative liberty, which is really the Western idea. All of us, we have the capacity to be free. So perhaps society and life should be about allowing us to do what we want, of course, within limits. And of course, the opposite of that is authoritarian government, where you have no capacity to do anything. The Western mind and the entire Western world is really about the idea of being as free as possible, to be able to do as much as possible, accumulate as much as possible. But the very interesting thing is when you look at the Eastern mind, particularly the Chinese mind, it's a completely opposite thing. For example, in the idea of Buddhism, the focus is less on the negative liberty, but more on the positive liberty, where it's not so much about having the freedom to do anything, but more the freedom to be free from yourself, from your cravings, from your own deficiencies, from the issues that we might have on the inside. So the idea is even if you were to be completely free in the Western sense, you could do anything that you want, you might still not be free. And I think all of us, we experience this. We have everything today, the most unimaginable distractions, Netflix, TV, YouTube, apps, anything really. We're so free. The societies that we live in around the world are so free, but we're actually not free from ourselves. We suffer from our own inner deficiencies. And that's really the sort of freedom that the Eastern mind would look at very differently, a freedom from yourself. And that might involve actually curtailing some of your negative freedoms, the freedoms that we expect, so that we can actually be positively free. It's a very different mindset. It's not so much about accumulation, but as you mentioned, subtraction. How do we actually take things away from ourselves that may be hindering us, especially in the way we think about life and also our philosophies?
Yeah, I like it. I think something that I want to try and get out of our conversation with today is drawing on the two worlds, where they're similar, where they're different, what each side gains and what each side might sacrifice, and then see if there can be a line between the two that we can dance, or if there is some strengths on both sides that we can sort of combine to be a kind of paradox of the East and West together, and kind of have an ideal philosophy towards the world, bringing those two together. We'll see how that goes.
And that
And I
that is
like
the grand project, isn't it? I mean, with these
that.
sort of comparative things, people like to pick sides, and at least my experience, especially with my page, you have a lot of people suddenly go on one side, oh yeah, the West is horrible. But I think that is an immature view because again, what we're all trying to do, and I think what all philosophers have been trying to do for centuries, thousands of years, is really to gain a more holistic understanding of human nature and the human condition. And like you mentioned, I think each side offers something different. And the more mature perspective is actually to have a bit of both, to be able to understand how to actually see things in the most holistic way.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, because I was even thinking in preparation for this episode about my relationship to the two stereotypical values of the East and the West and how that's changed across time. And it'd be very easy for us to shun the Western perspective and focus on the spiritually healthy, balanced perspective of the East. But actually, I've come a long way in focusing on the Western value of achievement. And I think Jacob and you yourself, Melvin, would agree with that, that actually achievement has done a lot for us in our lives and got us to a certain point. But the extreme perspective and the perspective about maximizing and adding more, which maybe we'll dig into further, only gets us to a certain point. And that's then when the Eastern perspectives on balance and trying to reduce desire and be fulfilled and find beauty and peace in the ordinary must come in. But achievement still has its place. I was listening to an interview between Alex Hormozy and Tony Robbins that Jacob suggested I listen to. And one line that I think is relevant is in discussion is when Tony Robbins was saying that achievement is a science and fulfillment is an art. And instead of trying to see those two in opposition with each other in the same way that we might see it as East versus West, actually they're just two different systems that provide us with different benefits and require different tools. So I guess what I'll start with is asking both of you, is there a line between the two?
Could I add to that point? So I totally agree with what you've said, and I think that, as I mentioned, that is the grand project. But I think the reality is at the moment is that the whole world is actually very Western minded, very Eurocentric, even in Asia. And I think it's because of history. You look at colonization, colonialism, and globalization, global trade, and of course mass media. Even in parts as far as Mongolia, even in parts of, for example, Southeast Asia, really anywhere, we all run on the Western model. For example, we all run on the economic system of capitalism. And of course, most countries are democratic. But the very interesting thing is that this thing that we've assumed as a default sort of model and the default way that humans work, or default human nature, is actually an outlier. There's a great Harvard professor, evolutionary psychologist and also an anthropologist, Joseph Henrich. He actually said the Western individual, the modern Western individual, is an outlier. And the way he described this sort of individual, this individualistic, democratic, capitalist sort of person, is actually weird, an acronym. Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. It is an outlier because for most of history, we don't really necessarily have democracy. Actually, you look at most histories, most cultures, it's been clans, tribes, empires, kingdoms, very authoritarian. Democracy is relatively unique, actually. Of course, now it's the sort of global default. The second thing as well is the idea of individualism is also an outlier. 500 years, really, you can trace it to the development of history and philosophy, how that whole thing came about. Again, not to say that what you mentioned is wrong. It's, of course, the grand project. But I think we need to realize that the whole world operates on the Western mindset. And I think we have to start from the position to see also what's wrong with it. Then we can really start to pursue that grand project that we're talking about here.
Mm. That's really interesting because coming into this, I thought it was more of a case of both the East and the West having a mentality of the grass is greener on the other side, with the West wanting the Eastern values and of like sort of some meditation and some sort of the wellness and I guess the China maxing.
No, that's a very interesting thing that you get. Sorry, but that's a very interesting thing you get today. People are talking about China maxing, how Chinese are so wise. But if any of you've been to China today, it's incredibly capitalistic. It's incredibly Western in many regards. Mass consumerist culture. Again, a lot of the issues that the West are facing, China is also facing, of course, to a different degree. And of course, there are different other issues too, political and whatnot. But I think the whole world is facing the issue that for most of history, the whole world has sort of developed towards this very Western mindset, both in its philosophical leanings and also in its economics as well. And I think all of us globally, we share the same issue now, where all of us, we're having this existential crisis, this philosophical crisis, where this Western model that we've all inherited, this Eurocentric way of living, is also deficient in many aspects. Like John mentioned, I love that. I didn't know it was described where, you have the science, which is, the science of pursuit, I suppose, and then the art of fulfillment. But I guess that's the issue. We've been so focused on the pursuit that we don't really think about the deeper values of fulfillment, which I think we can learn from traditional Eastern thought and Eastern, especially Chinese philosophical thought, because it's fundamentally different, and it really presents a different way of living and seeing the world that unfortunately not even many modern Chinese people today are practicing. And that's the reality, because you have a lot of Orientalists who say, the Chinese are so wise, but half the people in China are more than half, actually, most of them are facing the same issues that we're all facing, really, the same issues of a personal crisis. So I think that's very important, yeah, to highlight.
Yeah, it seems like it goes to such a fundamental point, um, that there are it's different, is in ways of viewing life and the purpose of life itself. One side is life should be about doing things for productivity, and maybe that's due to capitalist Western model that everything should be about output and building and creating and more and innovation. Whereas maybe the Eastern or older model, the pre-Western world model, is about experiencing life, and finding more balance, and that's where the fulfillment aspect comes in. Maybe to really kind of pin things down, um, Melvin, do you have any clear-cut criticisms you have then of this Western model, and can you then provide a sort of Eastern or historical difference in approaching life that you think would rectify that criticism?
Okay, what a great question, because it's really been much of my work recently over the past year. I've gone through in my own experience as well, sort of a crisis where I've become very disillusioned with just the way we're taught to live. And I think if we're really talking about East and West, and what the main criticism I might have is really the idea of individualism. Now, this is very interesting coming from me because for the longest time I was actually libertarian. I really love the works of Ayn Rand, and actually behind me I have like volumes of her work, and it really defined me for a big part of my life for a while. But I'm very disillusioned with it because if we're really to talk about the difference, it comes down to difference between the idea of individualism and collectivism. So whenever you bring these two things up, people immediately say, okay, it's about, like, for example, the US against China, and China is a authoritarian country where you have no rights. It's really much more than that if we're looking at it from a traditional and a philosophical standpoint. For example, in the Western idea, the individual is paramount. You are paramount. You exist. But in the Chinese philosophical standing, that's actually wrong. It's a categorical mistake to assume that the individual exists. It doesn't. Now, this sounds like a justification for, collectivist government. No, it's not really political. It comes down to this. When you look at the West and the history of the West, it's very interesting. I would say a few things. First, you had, I would say, the Protestant Reformation, where suddenly the middleman, I guess you can say, the church, was removed, and it's just now uh, the individual and God. There's no more in between. So the individual is just the next thing next to the highest authority. Then I would say you have the sort of Cartesian logic, where you exist as the foundation of all knowledge and potential existence. I think, therefore I am. The only thing we know is that we exist. We think, right? Therefore, if a devil was playing a trick on us, we know we exist because we are thinking. Again, the idea that the individual is the foundation of knowledge and existence. Then you have, I would say, Locke, who made this idea of the individual political. Suddenly now the individual have all these rights, that we share the right to do all these things that we want to do, curtailed only by the government if it serves the interests of us and of all. And then finally, I think in the Romantic era, where you have Rousseau and philosophers around that era, who really focus on the idea that there's this individualistic, authentic self that we should be able to express. When you tie all that together, I think this is just my opinion, you have the modern Western individual. It came in these developments. So the idea that the individual exists, the individual should have all these rights, the individual should be able to express and realize themselves. And that's a great thing. But in the Confucian view, the individual does not exist. And the reason why, you might think, oh, that's really strange. The idea is that actually, no, you exist in relation to your relationships. You cannot exist without your relationships. And the idea is because, think about it, when you are born, you are conceived and born by your parents. Then you're raised by your parents. And of course, all the people around you throughout your life, the relationships that you have, they define you. And with that sort of perspective, you can't really have an individual alone. The individual is conditional on the relationships that they have. And so the entire sort of Confucian philosophy is really about how we're all relational, and we have to see the world that way, rather than just us against the world. It's actually us in relation to everything else. There's no I, there's only an us. And this difference is very important, because then you have different sorts of thinking where if you put the individual as paramount, then yeah, you would think in a very individualistic way, like what I should do with my life should serve me, and everything is about me. But when you have the different sort of mindset, the Confucian mindset, where you realize that you are your relationships, and that goes even wider, you're also your community, then you start to think beyond yourself. And this produces very different sort of individuals. I mean, different sorts of people. And I think a lot of the problems that we have today personally is because we've been so driven and so ingrained with this individualistic mindset where we're trying to max ourselves in every way, in terms of our accumulations, in terms of our pleasures or whatever, that we feel so lonely and ultimately never fulfilled. We don't see the world in a more relational way, which is really what the Confucian mindset tries to do.
That's amazing. There's a lot to unpack. I think, first of all, this idea that individualism is the biggest problem with the Western mindset, I think you're really on something, because I think division comes with individualism, because when you're in a community, you're kind of all on the same path, you have the same values. And so I think the problem, I think, is a really unique problem to highlight, because I do believe that unity will always be better than division. And then I think, just to really understand for myself and the people listening about the historical timeline of how this came to be, from what I understand from you, what you just said, you highlighted one of the main. Firstly, there was kind of like a niche death of God, of like, we have potentially removed God from a joint value. We have removed God as
That
a
wasn't what
community.
I meant actually. So with the Protestant Reformation, you have, before the Reformation, we had, the person, the church, and then God. And actually, if you were to look at it from that perspective, at least from that sociological perspective, it was quite communal, because you have the church, which is also very important. Of course, it's got its criticisms, which is why the Reformation happened. But then suddenly the middleman, the church was, I mean, not the church, but the priest, the church, you could say, were removed, and suddenly it's now the individual before God. And there's a lot of buffering that's been happening in history and philosophy. I think there's this author, if I got his name correct, Charles Taylor, who talks about the buffered self, where suddenly there's a lot of buffering, and then the individual is slowly getting built. We don't need the church to realize our own spiritual path. It's just us. We don't need anyone to realize that we exist. It's just us, for example, Descartes. And of course, then you have the other ones too, where we should have rights to do whatever we want to do, Locke, and ultimately Rousseau and Romantics. We're all really special. It's all about finding ourselves. Life is about, cultivating ourselves. But again, the problem is this, I think, in the simplest term, if we were to think individualistically that way, then, for example, why should I come on this podcast if it doesn't serve me? Joel, why should you spend your time talking to me, or Jacob, why, if it doesn't serve you? And unfortunately, and also I suppose fortunately, because that's just how the world has been, the world has developed that way. But if you are to see everything that way about yourself, you also become deeply, deeply unhappy. This is now a very Buddhist thought. It's also a very Confucian thought, but it's also confirmed by psychology, modern psychology. To think in such a individualistic way, where it's all about serving yourself, single serving everything, is a deeply unhappy path. It also leads to greed. It also leads to all the issues that we see in the world today, wars, conflict, because we see the world in such a way where it's just about us, about me, about what's in it for me, and everything is about us rather than about the relation. But if we were to see in a Confucian way, it's different. I would come on this podcast because we are part of our society. What we're doing here benefits society, which benefits us. Me doesn't exist, it's us. I exist in relation to all the relationships I have, including the relationships I have with you guys. I should be on the show, or I should be doing a lot of things, because that's how we improve everyone. Nobody loses in that sense, because we're thinking in a more sort of collective mindset. Of course, in practice, it is also very difficult. But at least in tradition, in philosophical view, that is the sort of Confucian ideology, really, the relational view of the world. The highest virtue in Confucianism is actually ren, which is this, I guess, translated in English is humaneness, being good to one another. That is the highest virtue that you can achieve in Confucianism. The very interesting thing is that the word ren, the sound of it in Chinese, ren, is actually the same sound as the pronunciation of person, ren. They sound exactly the same. But this virtue, the way it's written, it's actually the Chinese word for human with a two next to it. And what that means is the highest virtue you can really achieve as a noble and cultivated person, the end goal of really being human is being genuinely good to one another. It's a very different sort of mindset compared to what we've been sold throughout all of history, really. And I think when we were to think like that, it's definitely much, much better for the world and also for ourselves.
Yeah, I think this conversation is really important, and there is a lot that I agree with. I mean, we've had conversations previously where we've discussed the self-centeredness that exists in a lot of negative emotion, and it's not the most rosy and happy thing to think about. But when you are anxious, you're focusing on a future where you are ostracized by the community, or something, a personal failure may happen in the future. That's why you're anxious, because of how it may look for you. And depression is a lot about rumination on mistakes in the past, or a very low sense of self-esteem and an obsession with how low one feels in comparison to others, and that self versus others dynamic emerges. There's a lot of great truth to that, and I agree with what's going on here, and how a more relationships focused way of life could benefit our mental health. But you said it's very difficult to do this practically, and I agree. So that's kind of where I want to shift this to now. And maybe I'll start by asking where you sit now, Melvin, with this understanding and with what you've read in this debate. What has changed in the way you think about your life? Because you achieved a lot of great material success, and for that, you had to have quite an individualistic mindset for a period of time. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I was reflecting as you were speaking that for me for what I've done in my sport in particular, I can't say I really did it for my relationships with other people. Like, yes, me getting better contributed better to our performance as a team, but I did a lot of it because I liked the feeling of winning. And especially as I was going through teenagehood, I liked the feeling of getting better and having people's admiration and respect. Now, is that terrible? Maybe it's not ideal, but there's still a space where throughout my development to where I am today, investing in myself has done quite a lot. But you could say my reading of philosophy and psychology has helped my relationship and made me more aware of other people's emotions and all that. But I wanna kind of dive into how your perspective might have changed even in your personal life, and then maybe we can draw things from that apply across other people. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. And it's such an important question. So a lot of people who don't really get Confucianism, or really Chinese philosophy, or a lot of Eastern thought, because it's all very similar, they would assume, okay, it's just about the collective good. Therefore, you are extinguished. For example, you mentioned you love your sport and you love being good at it, and you like to win. Is there anything wrong with that? There's actually nothing wrong with it, because in Confucianism, according to Confucius, one of the most important things you have to do in life is actually, in Chinese, it's called 修身, or I guess you could say self-cultivation. We should all cultivate ourselves and grow and be really good at whatever we're meant to do, or whatever we develop to do. That's very important. The sense of growth, I think, is one thing that almost all philosophical traditions agree on, the sense of cultivation. Growth is a very important thing. It's not extinguished. And of course, everyone has their own sense of growth as well. Everyone's very different. But where it starts to become very different is really near the end point. So the idea in Confucianism, if I were to summarize it in a very simple one-line thing, is you cultivate yourselves, you cultivate your family, then you cultivate the community, and hopefully cultivate the world. And that's really the idea. Become very good at what you do, but the end point isn't just to enrich yourself. End point is hopefully to enrich the world. And you don't lose anything in doing it if you believe that there's no you. You are in relation to all the relationships around you, including your wider community. And that's a very important thing. How does that apply to me? Well, like you mentioned, I've spent my entire life really with this Western mindset where I was taught in very simple terms, focus on yourself, become very good, do well for yourself, and then you'll be happy. But the fact is, I'm not happy. And the fact is, I think a lot of people are also not happy. That's just the fact that we all know. This model is really flawed because if you're only focusing on yourself and you burn everything else in your way, or you just focus on serving yourself, that self, especially when you look at it from the perspective of Buddhism, is endless. That craving is never ending. And also, furthermore, maybe the reason why you're never happy is because the self doesn't exist. That is the most important thing. One thing I want to tie back to is, for example, we go back to the Cartesian logic. I think therefore I am. For those of people who are watching this podcast, the idea is, okay, the devil is playing a trick. How do we know anything exists? We kind of know we exist because we're thinking about it. We're considering the potential illusion. Now, the Confucian perspective would be that isn't an evidence of a self before everything, because you're raised the way you're raised. It gives you certain mindsets, all the relationships you have. It makes you think in a certain way. That thinking mind, the questions you have also come from the relations around you. That's evidence that without the relations, you wouldn't even be in a situation to have all these questions that you might have. And that's a very important thing because we have to recognize that the relations are very important. But the Western model, what it leads to, especially if you want to maximize yourself, is you burn all the bridges with the people around you, your family, your friends, even the wider community. You are told, not directly, but we see it in practice that, oh, this will make you happy. Just focus on yourself, maximize everything. But it doesn't. You become incredibly isolated. In Confucianism, they call the person who does things for gain, in Confucianism, he calls such a person 小人, which in Chinese directly translated means small person. Now, it's a very interesting choice of words because basically in that idea is that you become a half-formed human or half-formed person. You don't become a full person until you realize that you have to be relational ultimately. Not because it's just what Confucius said, it's because it's recognizing that is what humans are. We are relations. It's how we exist in the first place. It's how we grow throughout life. And ultimately, the only thing that will bring us fulfillment when we align ourselves with our true nature. But again, individualism, capitalism sold us the total opposite idea. And no, you're special. You exist. Buffet from everything else. You're awarding on yourself. Therefore, focus on yourself. But again, it's a path to be very, very unhappy. I know that my own life experience, because again, as you guys have mentioned, I focus so much on that, on the pursuit of that. That's why I'm mostly doing philosophy nowadays, because again, philosophy doesn't necessarily pay the most. It's a very challenging field. It's a very niche field. It's also very abstract. But being able to do something beyond myself, with, I suppose, the gifts or perhaps the skills I've developed, I've been given and I've developed, makes me so much more fulfilled than just doing something that's purely enriching to myself. That doesn't feel like it's impacting anything around me, especially in a positive way. And I think, again, that's my experience. But anyone who finds themselves in this situation where they could experience kind of both, they would know too.
Mm.
Yeah.
The question that's I'm thinking about in my mind is, can you cultivate your family, your community, and the world by focusing on yourself first? Is there an overlap? Because the argument that I guess I can't take away from my mind is that by improving yourself, you kind of can benefit other people around you. By, I guess, say if I was to learn a skill, now I can teach other people those
Yes.
skills. And I
Yes.
think that's my kind of one argument. Now it's a sticky line because when Joel was talking about the kind of psychology, depression, anxiety, it reminded me of the Jordan Peterson line, which is like, there's no difference between thinking about yourself and negative emotion. Powerful, powerful line. But I think I think there is potentially a world of where you can cultivate everyone around you and improve yourself. Maybe that's actually is the kind of along the lines of the solution. So I'd love to know what you both think.
Yeah, as Melvin was speaking, I wrote down a couple lines that seem to put it all together, and I'm pleased that you began to point towards what I'm about to say, Jacob, with what you just mentioned there. And what I wrote here was about egoless self-cultivation. So you cultivate yourself and your skill set and your knowledge and your abilities and your ability to show up to the world in different contexts. You work on all of that and improve that for the main intention of aiding communities, beginning with the smaller communities of your relationship, your children, your brothers, your friends, your family at large, to then the wider community, to then, I mean, if you're really good at what you do, the world. We do live in an amazing time where individual excellence can lead to an improved experience for a massive collective of people, which is something quite crazy. I mean, it's very difficult to do and only done by a small minority of people, but it's possible. So there is no upper limit to how much excellence can benefit people, as long as it's not fueled by the toxic source of ego. And I think that's what, Melvin, when you mentioned the Chinese term of small person, the translation of small person,
Shaolin.
fits
Yes.
well for me, because if you're fueled by ego and purely self-investment, then the only person that can benefit is that ego. It has this insatiable diet where it can just eat and eat and eat, never truly be fulfilled, and never have the capacity to spread any of that benefit to others. Whereas if you can do it without ego, which maybe we can get into pathways to do that, it's a difficult thing. But if you can do that, then you can, that competence, that excellence, that greatness that you may find through self-cultivation can expand, and your influence, and therefore, you know, your mark on the world can expand. You can go beyond that small person mentality and philosophy,
Yes.
and
Yes.
spread your wing and spread your competence and excellence out into the world. And that's what the ultimate hero does.
Yes.
But that
Yes.
the important thing to focus on is we have to do it without pride. And pride is
Yes.
such a
Yes.
sneaky weapon. And it can, the
Yes.
devil can whisper in your ear through pride. It's not an overt vice. See that resonate.
Joel, that's amazing. You're basically a Confucian right now. That was an amazing explanation, but absolutely. Back to Jacob. So, no, there's nothing wrong with self-cultivation. Confucius also believed we have to cultivate ourselves. It is growth. Naturally in life, we grow. And not just Confucianism. You can look at it from the perspective of Daoism as well. Naturally, we grow. But where I guess there's a disagreement really from the West is two things. First of all, what is we? The West assumes we means I, me, you, Jacob. Um, that's we. But the Confucian perspective is no, actually, I doesn't exist. And it's not just Confucianism. Buddhism, same thing. Anatta, in Buddhism is the concept of no self. And in practice, it's very simple. Who is Melvin Poh? I could say I am Melvin Poh. Of course, it's obvious. I'm me. But does the me really exist? I am all my selves combined in a certain way, my neural pathways configured in a certain way, which both of which, and those are just two things, but so many things, all in a state of flux and change. There's no static. And even me as a psychological, as a psyche, I'm always changing. I'm talking about Eastern philosophy right now. When you guys spoke to me a while ago or something else, we are always changing. The idea of hanging on to a self is actually delusional in the Eastern mindset. And part of that delusion is why we're so unhappy. And also, as Joel mentioned, the Shaolin. So Confucius says, if we focus only on what we gain and just on fostering the self, we are a small person. We're never fully formed. We don't become fully human because a human is fully relational. That's how we exist. That's how we exist in relation to everything. And ultimately, the goal is where the difference is. The difference is in the idea that there is no self. Then the other difference is in the idea of ultimately what we should do. In the Confucian and Eastern mindset, it's really more relational. The relational mindset is really the end point. That's different. So as Joel mentioned it so perfectly, how can we actually cultivate ourselves and ultimately cultivate the world? But back to a question that Jacob mentioned, like how do we actually put this into practice? So in Confucianism, there's a very interesting virtue as well, or practice, a tenet. It's called li. I guess directly translated, it means ritual. The idea is you don't become immediately humane or ren immediately. It's natural. You don't naturally become like that. You have to try and foster it. You do it through ritual. So that's why when you go to China or when you go to Japan or you go to Korea, you will see, for example, people there, they bow to one another, especially in the context of business. I travel a lot for business around Asia. There's a lot of ritual. We'll spend time together, we'll have a dinner. You let the elderly people speak first and you respect them. And the thing is, even if you don't respect them, you do it anyway. Now, here's where the distinction is very obvious. In the West mindset, it would be like, look, I don't want to spend time with, this is not my feelings, but I don't want to spend time with Joe. I don't like it, let's say. Why should I go out with him? But in the idea, if let's say Joe is my senior, and the idea of the Confucian mindset would be like, you do it as a ritual to learn this, to cultivate this aspect where you respect your elders, because that's the sort of relationship you should develop. Of course, there are limits. If someone is truly abusive, something else. But we try and foster the practice. And the idea in Confucianism is eventually when you practice it enough, you start to develop these virtues. That's why when you go to, Asia, you see a lot of rituals, especially etiquette. They like to call it manners, but it's actually about Li. Another thing, for example, that's very important in Confucianism is the idea of shao or filial piety, which is we respect our parents. In the East, you have a very interesting difference with the West, where you see children being very close with their parents, even into their adult life. The idea of sending your parents away into an old folks' home or retirement home is almost impossible. It's such a taboo, really. And it comes down to this Confucian idea of shao, which we should try and respect and cultivate our parents because they're our roots. Confucius believed that if you can cultivate the most important relationship, the one that gave you your existence, it also develops the natural sort of mindset you have to all other future relationships, especially the wider world. So that's why you see, Asian children, Chinese children being very close with parents, not just Chinese, Japan as well, Korea. It all comes down to these traditional thought.
I want to comment on what you said there, but I want to just slightly pin back the ego thing and say one thing that I found interesting is you were saying that it's based on the Buddhist idea that there is no self, right? Then, and you define that as what you would refer to if you said the word I, and where is that thing? And I just thought to myself, when anyone tries to ask me how I define the ego, thinking it in psychological terms, the first thing I say is what you refer to when you say I. So I just think it's interesting that that bridge was drawn there, that from my sort of sports psychology perspective, I focus on the word ego for that thing that is a toxic fuel source for what we do. And that the Buddhists say that the best way to live life is understanding that self doesn't really exist. It's so fleeting. It's beautiful that those two worlds collide. And I feel like that's brilliant for us to start establishing a solution to this problem. And now when we're talking about the practicalities of the ritual, I like it a lot as well, because to me, a ritual gives connotations of a willingness to pursue and uphold the philosophy independent of opinion. Like you said, they are willing to treat somebody with the respect independent of how they personally feel about that individual, within reason, obviously. And to me,
Mhm.
that shows a discipline to stick to the principles of the philosophy. And like you say, that discipline over time and that willingness to show up with respect to the person, independent of what our ego may think of that person, okay? Because when we dislike someone, most often comes from the ego. That is where you build the virtues and they become implicit. Jacob had a point many, many months ago on the podcast about making virtues unconscious. And that's when they're truly virtues, when you don't have to
Yeah.
think about doing it. You're not doing it for a purpose. It's just
It comes
how
from
you are.
practice. It comes from practice as
Yeah.
well. It's a cultivation that we do, the virtues that we choose as well, the ideals that we decide to build our lives around. That's why these practices are very important. Yeah.
And ritual, I guess, is something that isn't valued in the Western model because we like
No.
novelty, different things. Every single day you can scroll and have
It's
a novel.
also against the idea of individualism. You think about it. If you're told, I've got to do this thing. Oh, it's against my freedom. Why should I do it? And why should I spend time with someone I don't like? Why should I do this? Why should I bow if I don't want to? It doesn't serve me. It doesn't reflect me. It doesn't reflect what I want. It doesn't reflect the unique me. again, it's so isolating the way way that this Western mindset is. Again, nothing against the West. It's just the mindset, the philosophy we've been given, the tradition we've been given.
Yeah,
Interesting.
I think okay. So step one, let's remove our ego. Um, how do we do that without taking ayahuasca? Like, because I think I've tried to like I think I've tried to decrease my ego a little bit, and what's worked for me is like less. Firstly, I think like less consumption of like things that move my behavior towards ego. So for me, that might be like aggressive music or like people that also have like big egos. And I think it's like a difference in the why that I do things. Is it for vanity, or is it for a kind of more existential drive? Like maybe it's towards God and his power. And I think that's kind of where I'm at the moment of like, okay, let's do things that shift behavior towards less ego. But
And one,
if
and that those things are rituals. They just put in a modern day version to abstain from certain music
Yeah,
or abstain
yeah,
from certain social contexts that fuel your ego, and to focus on humble reasons to do the things you do. That's
yes.
an every ritual to come back to those virtuous fuel sources. Go on, Melvin.
Hmm. Oh, well, I was going to say, yes, the ritual is very important. I think you both had mentioned it, perhaps having a discipline towards certain things. But I think to me, and again, I'm not plugging all of us because we're all, doing philosophy, but I think it comes down to philosophy. We need to start to rethink how we think about things. I'll give you guys a very personal example. So a few days ago, I caught up with a friend of mine who came from the UK, and he visited me in Asia. And actually, I've been really busy lately. I've been flying around actually, and he was leaving, and basically he wanted to catch up. But the very next day, I was very busy too. And basically, he wanted to meet me around midnight, and I was really tired. And I was thinking to myself, why should I? Because again, I could catch up with him again, and even going now, like it doesn't immediately benefit me. Then I started to remind myself, oh, I'm thinking from the perspective of just me. Let me think a bit wider. This guy was actually a really important person to me. He is a very important person to me, a very important friend. But he's not in my life now. I know my presence would also make him happy. And I might be tired right now, but I think I can do it. It could be an excuse. So I went and we spent time and we were there for several hours. So I was really tired afterwards. But I felt very fulfilled because he was very happy. And eventually he sent me a very long message too about after the meet. And I think that's a very beautiful thing when you stop thinking about, okay, it's just me, because again, that could be a delusion where you're just thinking that term. It's a very isolating term. There really is no you. You are your relation. Even you right now, this idea of you are constantly being defined by the relations around you, either directly or indirectly. And choosing to see the world wider than yourselves brings much more fulfillment really than just thinking about yourself. It comes down to how you see yourself ultimately. I think that's the very important thing. And that change, I think, is simple and also hard at the same time. But it starts with that when we stop thinking, okay, it's just me. It really is a delusion to think the self exists. Yes, it exists as a phenomenon, this feeling of you, but when you really look at it, who you are is formed by all the relations you have. And that's also confirmed by psychology and science as well. But yet we've convinced ourselves so much that no, it's all about me. And the culture around us and the media around us has convinced us as well that it's all about us. It's an incredibly isolating way to live that I think not only makes you worse, but makes the world worse.
So, what do the Confucians say about relationships that are harmful to us, or when we become hyper fixated on a certain relationship and that is painful for our mental health? Like the fact that we can't control other people, and that they have a stake in the relationship, and any time they can betray us or cut us off or break our hearts and things like this. I agree with a lot about what you're saying. I think one can find a lot of meaning through focusing on their impact on others and their relationships. But what does this philosophy say for the toxicity that can sometimes emerge from relationships? I'm interested.
What a brilliant question. So in Confucianism, there is a very important tenet called 五伦, or I guess translated, the five relationships. So Confucius basically defined the archetype of the five relationships we could have in our lives. First, you have the relationship between the ruler and the subject, as in the government and us. Then you have between, the father and the child. And then you have between the husband and the wife, and then the friend and the friend. So the idea is these relationships exist. These are the different roles exist. And within these five relationships, you have a duty. For example, in the relationship of the ruler and the subject, you have a duty to obey your government. However, the duty is actually, both ways. The government has a duty to serve you. In the same sense, a father has a duty to father you, or your parent has a duty to parent you, and you have a duty to respect and be filial. But again, it's both ways. In a situation where basically one side has not fulfilled its duty, then of course you don't have to respect or try and cultivate it. But at the same time, Confucius is very clear. It doesn't mean you become a Shaolin, a small person, and you just suddenly try to destroy them. You try to be very good, but you don't let that relation pull you down. You learn to cultivate yourselves and try and move beyond it. But again, you have to be very clear as well. It's not, destroying somebody or, suddenly causing a riot. It's actually an aspect of how do I kind of transcend or resolve the situation without going to the means of becoming someone very petty or the small person, as Confucius said. Yeah.
I think it comes back
Okay,
to that ritual. It comes back to rituals, I guess. It's principles that we add to the frame of things. Like it's all about framing, and it's having that. It's the way that we interpret each scenario, and then yeah, I think that's really good. So if we kill our ego and we are sort of real and we are ritualistic.
There's a what is it? There is a great show. What was it? I watched it a while ago. Is it The White Lotus? I can't remember. Yeah, I think it's White Lotus. It's basically a show um, about this resort, and then within one of the many storylines, there was a person who he got in a very petty sort of conflict with this hotel manager, and for many episodes, just him trying to get back at the other person trying to get back at him, and it just endlessly goes on until it's just horrible for both of them. So in the Confucian mindset, yes, if a relationship is abusive or toxic, or a person has failed their duty towards you, you don't have to bind yourself to that relationship, but you also don't lose yourself in trying to, let's say, be vindictive or vindicate yourself. You still cultivate yourself and try and be the best of yourself beyond that relationship. Again, in life, you will have many relationships, parental even beyond your immediate biological parents. You will meet parental figures, mentors, show the respect. But if they are truly not dutiful towards you, they're not being a good person to you, you don't have to bind yourself to them. It's not so black and white and so binary in that sense. Yeah.
Amazing. I wanted to pivot to a topic that I don't know too much about, but I wonder if you have any thoughts on how the East see God different to the West.
Yeah, very, very different perspectives as well. So in the West, we generally have a lot of, I suppose you could say, monotheistic kind of religious approach. And if I were to make it very simple, I think there are two characteristics about it. Religion in the West is very consistent. It's also very exclusive. You're either Christian or you practice Judaism or whatever religion that you have. And generally there's this one God that's the creator of everything. And then there are all these things you have to follow as part of the religion and its ideology. Well, the very interesting thing is, again, I cannot speak for all Eastern traditions, but largely, I guess I'll talk about Chinese and Buddhism. It's very different. There is no God in a sense, because the first question we would ask when we look at the difference is, what is God exactly? In the Western idea, God is this creator, this supreme being, very much the Western individual blown up to universal size. He's got a will, he's got a belief system, and he enforces it as part of his religion, and he created the universe and life, and we follow him. But in the Chinese mindset, to begin with, it's very different. For example, in Confucianism, there's actually no God, at least philosophically speaking. Famously, one of the students of Confucius asked him, so what do you think about God? And his answer was a very good answer too. You have not yet understood life, and you want to understand death. We haven't fixed life yet, so let's not focus on God yet. But in Confucianism, there is something called Tian, which in English translation often is translated as heaven. But even the heaven is very different. The Tian in Confucianism is actually a universal moral order. It's not a place. It's sort of like cosmic moral order that people align to. The difference, though, is there are no clear tenets. It's not like 10 commandments of this is how we should practice our lives. It's this moral order that we would understand once we cultivate ourselves. It's sort of this cosmic, I guess you could say, justification for why we should all be moral. Because when you really cultivate yourself, you start to realize that you're aligning yourself to this cosmic moral order. But again, Confucianism and then most of Chinese philosophy, they don't exactly define it. Then you have Daoism, which is a very different philosophy compared to Confucianism, but also very similar. There is absolutely no God, no heaven, just nature. It's a natural order that we try to align ourselves to. So in Daoism, with Laozi and Zhuangzi, these philosophers, they talk about aligning ourselves to nature and the flow of nature itself. And that's what life should be. Again, you get very popular concepts that's often mentioned in philosophy, Wei and all the other ones, or Zirang. These are concepts from Daoism. I actually recently watched one of your episodes where someone misattributed it to Shunzi. It's actually not Shunzi who came up with it. It's actually Laozi. But the point is, again, there is no God, but aligning ourselves with nature. And then the very interesting thing is you have Chinese folk religion or folk belief where there are a lot of gods. You have the god of fortune. Every Chinese New Year, we would pray to him to become richer. You have a god of exams. You have a god for almost everything. But the very interesting thing about the Chinese folk religion is that even their gods and goddesses and their heavens, they mirror basically real life bureaucracy, where you have an emperor and then you have different departments. And even the hell is also very, very interesting. It's very bureaucratic. If you've sinned in your life in the Chinese folk belief, you go into hell, but there are 18 levels. Depending on what you did, you get slotted to a certain level. Once you've been punished in that level, then you get reborn again. Again, you don't stay in hell forever, for example, in the Christian belief. So in practice, it's very interesting. In the West, we have people who align themselves to one religion, one religious belief with its system, and this idea of this one God who is also very individualistic. And then in China, for example, you have people who practice Confucianism in public life. They practice Daoism in private life. And then they believe in basically folk religion where there are many different sorts of gods and Buddhas. And then when they're about to die, they generally practice Buddhism in the traditional sense. And that's very interesting because basically they have a variety of practices. But again, in these Eastern thoughts, the idea of God is very different. It's also not individualistic in the sense that the Western one is. And that also generates a totally different sort of mindset because, again, religion is also philosophical. Again, it educates how people sees life and their existence.
So it's kind of moving away from the personified, anthropomorphized divine in the West, rather than heaven being a place. It's a way of life. It's a moral code that one can act out. It's kind of like the divine is a
Yes,
process. Divine is a way of being. It's a way of nature that we must align our being to, and in that
exactly.
we will be. And yeah, there is a stark contrast there, and it's interesting. It kind of relates to how I feel when I feel I'm living on that line. Well, you could call it aligned with God if you want to use fancy terms, but if it's just when my life feels like it's in good order in myself and in my relation to others and in my work, it feels like that has to come from process. It's a lot more active. It's a lot more about engagement and a lot more about how I'm impacting myself and the community, which I guess makes sense with the overall philosophy of the East. So I can see how these differences emerge. Interesting.
Actually, a very good point. So I'll give you guys an example. Again, I've been baptized Anglican, so and my parents are very devout Christians. So to put into real life practice of how the differences actually manifest in the sort of Christianity, the Christian mindset, we have the idea. I think, Joel, you mentioned earlier in the show, the idea of the Protestant work ethic. It really began with the Calvinists, but the idea is that look, you've got to really dedicate yourself to your work or maybe to your devotion, and that brings you very close to God, and you have to actively do it. And again, be frugal, be dedicated on this path, this religious path, or even your life with your career. And again, this sort of active practice, which also defines much of Western religions, even beyond Christianity, a lot of devotion, a lot of active pursuit of it. But if you were to look, for example, at Daoism, they would advocate the total opposite. For example, the concept of wei, or wei in English, a lot of people tend to mistranslate as no action. It's not actually no action, it's effortless action. And the idea is that there's a way to nature that we should align to because that's just the way nature is. And the more we actively try to deviate and become, for example, more intentional or focus more on like active action, the more we actually become misaligned with nature. It's a total opposite of the idea of devotion. There's a very famous story that advocates this very well, that highlights this very well. Zhuangzi once told a very famous story about this cook called Ding, this cook. A duke asked him to prepare a meal with an ox. So he very beautifully and masterfully cut down the ox, to get the meat. And the Duke was so impressed because he did almost like a dance. And then the Duke asked him, "How did you do this?" And he said, "I didn't actually do anything. I just flowed with it. I noticed the gaps and I just went with it because, again, this is how I did it. For the past 19 years, I've been trying to hack the cow. But now I realize just to let go and follow the natural flow of where the meat's on the gap. And I just go with it." And that's why, according to the story, whereas a junior chef would probably have to change their knives or sharpen it every month, he does it every year or every few years because he's so masterful. And even this is really interesting because, again, the idea of Western religions, you have to do all this practice, all this devotion, and reflecting as well in careers. You have to be so intentional, hustle hard, be disciplined, and do all these things to get there. The Taoist idea is actually, no, you've got to learn to step back and go with the flow. And this is also reflected in psychology. I think, Joel, you can give some perspective here because, for example, a lot of sports people, famously, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, that psychologist, the idea of flow, when you focus a lot on the intentional action, it's not the best. But when you start to master it, it becomes very effortless. And Taoism would urge you and encourage you to go towards the flow, or not even urge you, encourage you, actually. It's against the idea, but naturally start to align yourself with the flow of things. It's a very different sort of philosophy and ideology.
Mm. Yeah, mastery. When you reach a state of mastery, you actually remove yourself from the situation. And we can think about that in specific contexts in the sporting world. You're a good enough basketball player that you don't have to think about how you need to play basketball. It's implicit. It's a flow. Or, your story about someone in the culinary world. If you don't have to think about all the details of a dish you're making, and you can allow your knowledge and your expertise to just manifest itself in the kitchen, or whether you're an artist or a musician, we see this a lot with virtuosic musicians, how they can just play like it's second nature, how the instrument becomes just a part of their body. It's a real thing. And anyone trying to reach excellence in a field should have an understanding of that. And I find it very useful just to release pressure in big moments when I have to perform, knowing that if I'm good enough at it, I don't have to get involved. But also, I was drawing a comparison as you were talking that this dynamic of removing yourself from the situation may also emerge in our philosophical pursuits, because the more that we connect with God or the natural way of nature or the way of being or the divine, the more we remove our individual self, our individual ego from the situation. And that's a
Yes.
wide meta game than basketball or playing the violin or being a Michelin star chef. That's about being a spiritual being. That's the journey of your soul. And so the more you But the more you master yourself internally, the more you remove yourself from the situation. And that's a wisdom that I think can be transferred across all domains. It's interesting.
I just really
Yeah,
want to
yeah.
hammer this
You summed
point
it up
that
perfectly. Yeah.
I just really want to hammer this point that like the Eastern religions kind of removes the figurehead from the domain. Like the Confucianism doesn't have a god at all. I think I've seen in one of your videos, Melvin, about how the Buddha's facial expressions are always like very consistent, and
Yeah.
they're very like they're just like a
Yes.
the Buddha doesn't really have a
Yes.
facial expression. um you can't even like read anything
Yeah.
about it, and I think it's very it is this like even the gods, there's kind of like no self. You'd obviously you'd have mentioned the one that there's lots of different gods, but I think this is a
In
general
folklore, yes. In folk religion,
info.
yeah. Mm.
And then the story about the cook was very interesting because it really is just reinforcing this like I am a meat vehicle, and it's not me doing any of this, it's just a spirit that's running through me. And I think that would
Yes.
be it is such a like refreshing perspective to have, because I think I just see that as like you'll instantly increase your happiness if you think like that.
That's how
Yeah.
you self-cultivate without going pride, because the
Yeah.
cultivation done to give back to the God or the way of nature or the way of being that allowed you to do that thing and to be who
It,
you
it
are.
yeah. Yeah, it's not just that as well. For example, when you look at Western religion, especially in Christianity, Saint Augustine, he really created the idea of how the world works in terms of progression. And more or less, the West has a very linear idea of time. So in the case of St. Augustine, you have creation, Genesis, of course, you have fall, Adam and Eve, and the rest of history that transpired and is transpiring, and eventually the last judgment. So everything's very linear. But in Confucianism and in Daoism, time is actually very cyclical. There is no creation in the traditional sense. For example, in Confucianism and Taoism, the idea of how the world came about is just it came about. Like in terms of naturally, it came about. Natural forces came about. There's no this one single genesis point. It just happened to be. And not just that, the world constantly in terms of time is cyclical. In the Chinese belief, you've got the different seasons, the different dynasties. They rise, they peak, they fall. Everything follows this cycle. Most and then best encapsulated by, I guess, the image of yin yang, the yin yang, the black and the white with the dots. It's always turning. The cycle's always turning. Same with Taoism. In nature, everything's always turning. There's a cyclical understanding of time. Now, this also changes how people live and act. For example, in the West, and again, I'm also talking about myself because I've mostly lived in the West. We have the idea that time is linear. Therefore, we're thinking, are we late? Are we not doing this thing by the certain age? Should we be? Are we behind? This idea that, oh, we're not ahead. Are we behind? Can we get further? Where are we? It's this idea of a race, a straight line. But if you were to adopt the Eastern mindset, particularly Confucianism and Taoism, then you realize there are natural seasons and cycles to things. Sometimes you're at the very top, sometimes you're at the very bottom, but there's no fixed time. It's always churning and turning. That I think removes a lot of the existential anxiety that people have nowadays, where they think, oh God, I'm not on the, I don't know, 40 under 40 list, therefore, the end. Time doesn't work that way, at least in the Eastern thought. Again, it also comes from the religious belief as well, and the philosophical belief about what time is.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Even down to our individual experience of life. Even our energy goes in cycles. There is day and there is night. Work, there is time to rest and have leisure. There even our interest in things wane and go in cycles. Sometimes we're enthralled by a book we're reading and then that time ends, or we're focusing on a particular skill or in one stage of our career and we're at the height and our motivation is as high as it can be, but naturally it'll dip and it may rise again. And I've never thought about it that way, that the linear way that we think about time, and that in opposed to that, we can have the understanding that things will happen in their moment when it's right, when we hit the right rhythm in the overall cycle of our life, and the life of the universe itself. And nothing is constant. Like nothing is
Exactly.
constant. If we
Yeah.
think a problem we're dealing with or something that's going really right is never going to be. There's such a transient fleetingness to all things. So the only way we can find stability in that is through recognizing the instability and being able to, like you say, flow and be and connect with the natural way of the universe, with the ups and downs, with the cycles. It's beautiful.
So for an example, like when I spoke to you the other week, Joel, and I was like, I want to like grow hard on the podcast this year, and then we figured out like what the reasons why we can't do it, and why we're not in that life stage to be able to go all in. The perspective of this kind of like there's no race; it will come when God wants it to be. Is that the sort of the right perspective of like in our ambitions, in the things that we want to achieve, it should just flow and it should just come to us when God decides that we're ready.
Well, yeah, there are seasons to life. There are
Yeah.
seasons where other things take larger priority, and that's okay. I feel like Melvin's right when he said that we fixate on the race that doesn't even fucking exist. The
Doesn't.
line, there is no finish line, because even if you got to this fake finish line that you imagine, I mean, we've talked a lot about how disappointing destinations are in life. We don't want the cycle to end. We don't want it to be linear, because if it's linear, then there's an end point, and end points are horrible. We want constant flow, and it does sort of ease the pressure on things, and just you take kind of existential deep breath. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, you have faith in the way that things will play out.
Yeah. If I could add to that, so I think here, Jacob, what you mentioned, I think Taoism offers an incredible perspective. Again, by the way, I have total respect for all religions. Again, I'm a baptized Anglican myself, but there's a lot we can learn from all these different perspectives. The idea of guess, I suppose, Christianity, especially the Protestant work ethic, the idea that it's all in your hands, whether you get close to God or get close to your goal, it's all in your hands, your discipline, what you can do. Taoism would say, don't think like that. Time is not linear, it's cyclical. Like Joe mentioned, there are seasons, there are cycles to it. And actually, rather than be so fixated on what you can do, am I actively getting there and ultimately burn yourself out, or even worse, put yourself in a totally horrible mental position, realize that just embrace things in a more effortless way. Realize there are cycles to things. And actually, the better thing is to align with things that are natural. Let me try and explain this concept. So in Taoism, the focus in the West is always on Wu Wei. That's like a very popular thing I keep seeing videos on, which is why I try not to make any videos on it. But there is another concept that's equally very important called 自然, which in translation, I suppose, means naturalness. The idea is there's a naturalness to things that we should try and achieve. And it's not an easy thing to get to. Kind of similar to the idea of flow, where instead of actively trying to make things different and change and try and, reach the viewership that you want, try and embrace the things that you only notice when you let the natural things develop, or the natural things around your life, the little things that you start to notice that you can really follow. And when you follow the natural path, just like the way the chef cut the ox, where you follow the natural lines of the curvature of the ox, that's when things become really perfect. I see a lot of people nowadays, which is really, to me, also quite concerning. A lot of people getting into content creation on philosophy. And a lot of them are great. I really love them. I think it's a really important space. But a lot of them I feel are very forced. And you have people who try to get into this space because I don't know why, I suppose viewership. But again, they're forcing themselves. And the outcome is we don't know whether they'll do well. That's one thing. But the other thing is you're not being genuine to yourself. I believe everyone has something special to offer, but we have to discover what that thing is rather than try and force and become someone else. There's a really beautiful story also from Taoism, also from Zhuangzi, story of a tree where it summarizes in Chinese, 没用之用, the usefulness of uselessness. where the story basically is this. There was a person, suppose they are loggers. They were walking past this forest, and there's this really beautiful ancient tree with all these branches everywhere. And then the apprentice of the logger said, "Shall we cut this one down?" And then the person replied, the master logger said, "No, we don't cut this one down because it's useless. It's such an old tree. If you were to use it, it would rot very quickly. And look at all the branches, they're everywhere. You can't build anything with it. You can't make even a door with it. It's completely useless. So let's just leave and find something else." That night, apparently, he had a dream where the tree actually appeared in his dream and said, "You said I was useless, but my uselessness is actually my usefulness. Because of how useless I am, I've lived for so long." And it's a really quaint story, but I think it runs totally contrarian to, again, the Western idea that you've got to be very useful. But the deeper truth is, the more you try to foster your usefulness, the more you try to achieve all these metrics, all these things, the more stress you actually create for yourself. Whereas if you actually align yourself to the way you naturally are, just like the tree, how it naturally grew to the way it is, rather than, conform and be like all the other trees, you might find something truly special, both in the sense of your personal salvation, but also personally in your sense of growth. And I think that's also a very beautiful thing that you can learn from Daoism. Totally different philosophy. Not the idea of where you can devote yourself to something, a god or a thing, and then get that. It's the idea you learn not to devote, but to recognize natural rhythms or natural way of life and try and pick
Yeah,
up on it. It's not easy.
it's
And
a
that's why
shift
Daoism is also its
from
own entire philosophy.
using the potentially Western oriented analytical brain to think about our life and what's productive and what's useful to do and what we should be focusing on and forcing to happen, and leading more with the heart or the soul or whatever term you want to use, and following what feels intuitively meaningful and what naturally emerges as the right path. And that takes a different level of awareness and presence and a different level of attention. But I think there's something to it, and I think it will lead to significantly less stress. So that's very useful for me and Jacob here and people listening. Now, Melvin, we are coming near to the end of our time today, and we always like to ask our guests the same last question, and that is an opportunity to say anything that you feel you need to express or haven't expressed in the episode so far. That can be something to me and Jacob. It can be something to the audience. It can be something that you've been thinking about a lot recently that you think the world needs to hear. And we give you the opportunity to freely express that before we say our goodbyes.
Right. What a great question. I think with everything we've discussed today, the one last thing I'd like to express is, again, the way that we assume our lives are, and the way we assume that we should live, is not necessarily the best way to live. And all the problems that we experience with our lives, all the unhappiness that we have, all the personal crises that we have, all the questions that we have about existence, it all comes down to, again, how we really think, and especially how we think about the sort of philosophies that we have in our lives. What we don't realize is that whether we're actively doing it or not, we are basically developing a philosophical system with all the influences around us. And just because everyone teaches us to think a certain way and see things in a certain way or pursue certain things doesn't necessarily mean it's right. And I think ultimately it comes down to trying to understand how life is, how the world really is, how the human condition really is, by being more open to different sorts of traditions, whether it's East or the West. I don't think one way is necessarily correct. I know for the entire episode, we focused mainly on the East, especially in a more constructive view of a lot of philosophical things we talked about. But again, having a balanced perspective is very important. But being able to identify constructively what's lacking and also maybe a different alternative perspective to actually seeing things, I think that's very important.
Where should people go if they want to find out more about you?
Right. Empirical.thought, my Instagram page, where
There you
I
go.
share my thoughts quite regularly. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.